Hi dear hunters, Dr. Nordberg here again. Today I'm going to tell you all about Rut Phase 4, the recovery phase. And this is part 1. You know, some years ago, well, quite a few years ago, back in the 1980s, I used to consider this phase of the rut, Phase 4, to be the most important phase for hunting older bucks. And I felt that way because while breeding was in progress, it was awfully hard to predict where we'd see a really large buck, like the dominant breeding buck of the hunting area that you're hunting in. You could never count on that buck being in the same place 2 days in a row, or using the same trail. It was kind of tough. Not until breeding was over could I count on a buck being in the same place for maybe 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 days, maybe a week. That place was the buck's bedding area. After breeding is over, this buck has been through months of real turmoil, physical activity and battling, and he's a worn out buck. By this time, a dominant breeding buck can lose as much as 30% of his total weight, although I've never seen him lose that much, but they sure can be a wreck. They're walking around with their heads hanging low, and they can be drooling, and their eyes look all red, and that is really a tired, beat buck. And all he wants most, once breeding is over, and usually he'll know about it within 24 hours, he's expecting that, having been through this in years before, that all of a sudden none of the does are going to be in estrus anymore or in heat. So finally, within 24 hours, usually, it seems rather quick, he knows it's time for him to take a rest. There won't be any more breeding going on for 2 weeks, just a 2-week period. This phase 4 is a 2-week period like Rut Phase 3. So he's going to head to the safest place he knows, where he's unlikely to be bothered by wolves or human hunters. And that place is his summer-long bedding area, where he spent most of his time while his antlers were developing. A safe place, out-of-the-way place, secluded, hard to find. Most hunters only find a buck bedding area like this by accident while scouting or hunting. Usually it's a place where you'll see a cluster of antler rubs on larger trees. If a dominant breeding buck is bedding there, you'll see a lot of antler rubs that are on trees 4 or more inches in diameter. There can be some smaller ones, but if there's bigger ones, you know, let's say there's 4 smaller ones and 2 bigger ones, the bigger ones tell you the story. This is the bedding area of a dominant breeding buck. So, and this is one place where you're going to see an awful lot of droppings on the ground. The first thing that happens when a buck gets out of his bed to go off and go feeding or go searching for does or whatever is empty his bowels. And there'll be droppings of one big size. They'll probably be, you know, if it's a dominant breeding buck, they'll be at least 3/4 of an inch in length and larger. Some of our bucks that we've taken in past years had droppings as long as 1 1/4 inch in length. That's pretty big. But you'll see various ages. There'll be old, dull-looking droppings like that, and then there'll be fresh ones that are still shining. You'll see lots of those in this small area. Usually it's only about 1 or 2 acres in size where they bed. And you'll see a lot of those droppings in that bedding area. And you'll see beds, of course. If there's snow on the ground, you'll find beds that are anywhere from 50 to 56 inches in length. Really big one of those 305-pound bucks we take almost every year, will have a bed at almost 56 inches in length. Really a heavy, big buck. But 50 inches is still a really good one you'd probably want to put on the wall for sure. Anyway, you'll see a lot of those, and you don't necessarily have to have snow on the ground to find beds like that. Bucks like to lay in deep grasses, and if there's deep grass in this bedding area, they'll be laying in there. And when they lay down in deep grass, that you can't see them unless they raise their heads. And when they raise their heads, they can look out over the tops of the grasses to check on their surrounding once in a while. But they love to bed in deep grasses. And if they've been bedding there, you'll find beds. You'll find bedding areas in the grass, and you can measure that length of that bed, and it'll tell you this is the bedding area of a great big buck. So those are kind of really neat places to find, and your odds of taking a big buck there are fairly good. I wouldn't say excellent, because hunting bucks in their bedding areas is really difficult to accomplish, to be successful. Well, anyway, getting back to what's happening in rut phase 4. I call this the recovery phase, and that's mainly for the big dominant buck. They're really wore out, and it'll take them a couple of weeks actually to get back into their former physical shape, ready to go again. Especially the first week. The first week is they just don't move much. They'll feed and water. Water is usually always close to a buck bedding area. They'll feed and water and bed in that same area for up to a week without hardly leaving the area. Maybe a little sooner, depending on how wore out the buck was. But at any rate, this is a place where the buck can be counted on to be seen, or at least to be living in this small area for 1 to 2 weeks. And that's what makes it a time when you can take a big buck by stand hunting in one location, or maybe several locations around the bedding area. The critical part, though, is being able to accomplish it without being identified by the buck. Once that happens, something else happens. So I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But there's other things that happen during this phase. You know, you might not realize it's happening, except that, you know, does begin estrus 2 weeks earlier. And I told you in my last YouTubes what to look for when does are in estrus. Well, keep that first date in mind, and remember, it'll be over in 2 weeks. Now, where I hunt, it's over on the 16th of November. On the 17th, that big buck is going to be in his spring, summer, fall bedding area, and he won't be moving far from it. So if you found that, you know, while scouting, you know, the antler rubs might be old at that point, but they're still going to be very visible. A year-old antler rubs are still easy to see. And all the other signs, lots of tracks made by a big buck, tracks that are 3 3/4 to 4 inches long, and those beds that I told you about, and the droppings. And most of those droppings will be clumps, meaning they're stuck together in clumps. And that's typical of buck droppings in fall and early winter. Well, breeding is in progress. Remember, breeding isn't over after that first 2 weeks in November. We still got 2 more 2-week periods to come when does will be in estrus again. Smaller numbers, to be sure. But anyway, that part is not over yet. But during this 2 weeks period, the big bucks are resting in their bedding area, somewhere in that square mile that they own. They're the king buck. There's this secluded area where they bed, near water, usually within 100 yards of water. But anyway, magically, all of a sudden, all those lesser bucks that have been living in seclusion off range come back. The big buck, the big dominant buck, and all those lesser bucks that he chased off range all seem to realize at once breeding is over for the time being. And at this point, all those bucks that have been chased off range will come back. They'll be back within 24 to 48 hours. And all of a sudden, there's all kinds of other bucks in your hunting area. If it hasn't been over hunted, or it hasn't been, hasn't had a lot of still hunters walking all over it for days on end, or people making drives through the area. But if you've been stand hunting, if you and your partners are standing hunting in this particular area, those bucks are going to stay there. They aren't going to run unless they've been shot at. But they're going to stay in their original home ranges, and but they aren't going to move much during that time. But anyway, those are things to look for. You won't see a big buck traveling with a doe anymore. You won't see railroad tracks in the snow during this period. You won't be seeing tracks of a big buck with tracks of a doe in the snow at this time. The last thing that big buck wants to see at this point is a doe in heat, and he won't. There won't be any around for 2 weeks. So those are signs. Then all of a sudden there's other tracks, like of lesser mature bucks, the lesser being lower on their local pecking order. And they'll be back, and those bigger bucks will have tracks that measure anywhere from 3 5/8 inch in length to 4 up in northern states, maybe a little smaller where you hunt if you hunt in the southern states. But anyway, those tracks all suddenly become real common in your hunting area, which is kind of exciting because it's a time when you can take some decent bucks, even if it isn't the big dominant breeding buck. And they won't be just laying around for 2 weeks like the big buck. They're going to be active. It'll be kind of like it was during the bow season before breeding began, and it'll be early bow season when it'll be all these deer running around in their normal home ranges, and you'll be finding tracks. Good time to hunt them. Like during phase 3 of the rut, good place to hunt all those other bucks is in feeding areas. But we'll talk more about that later. Another thing that happens in the early part of phase 4 is that when that big dominant buck is finally heading toward the bedding area, he almost immediately starts treating other bucks a lot differently than before. That buck, big dominant buck, is no longer interested in keeping other bucks out of his range. From this time on, it's not important to him, and especially if there's no does in estrus. And he's not going to be charging or chasing bucks. At this point, he'll actually act friendly toward them. You know, all of a sudden they're thinking, what's the matter with that buck? He isn't going to kill us like he used to do. And what he's doing is encouraging one or more of them to trail him. And it's quite common to see 2 bucks together at this period, one bigger one and one smaller one, sometimes 2 that are almost equal in size. But he wants another rested buck to follow along to act as a guardian, more or less, while he rests and sleeps. Other buck that'll be sharper, more alert during the period that he's bedding. And he needs that because he's quite vulnerable at this point yet because he's so wore out. So he wants a sentinel buck, and this is a good opportunity for lesser bucks as young as yearlings to learn something about what it's like to be a big buck, and things you have to do in the future. So it seems almost as if there are plenty of those lesser bucks around who are really anxious to be able to spend time with that big dominant buck. And this is the time for them to get a good education about what's going on. So if you find tracks where 2 big bucks have been together, or you actually see them over there, 2 big bucks together, or maybe even 3, you never know. That's another indicator that the primary breeding phase of the rut is over. When we get into that second week, he isn't going to maintain ground scrapes. He's kind of not going to renew ground scrapes or antler rubs. It's kind of rare during this period. Although, there have been times I've wondered about things like that, and I've been in the woods, and gee, here's one of the dominant buck's big ground scrapes here, and it hasn't been used in weeks. And I'll kick snow over it or leaves or something like that. I've done that on several occasions over the years. And a lot of times I'll come by there the next day and look at that son of a gun that's been here, and he renewed it. They just don't like all that stuff kicked over their ground scrapes, even though it's not so important to them, or maybe it is, but I've seen that happen. So, but you won't find a lot of that. And it's sure a waste of time to be hunting along scrape trails at that particular period. Actually, during the rest of the year. This is the end of part 1. Be sure to watch for part 2, and you'll learn much more about how to hunt older bucks during this particular phase of the rut.